Okay, so to give you guys an understanding of my background, I do independent AWS security consulting, which primarily means that I'm not an Amazon employee, which means that I can speak a little bit more honestly and critically of Amazon than a lot of people might. I also own my own company, so when I speak, it is the opinion of myself and my company. So it gives me a lot of freedom that way. So this talk is going to be, I'm going to try and generalize it to be about cloud security. However, I am going to end up focusing a lot on Amazon because that is where my focus area is. Also, however, for people that might not understand the cloud market, Amazon is definitely the dominant player in it. So depending on how you measure the cloud and what you define as the cloud, Amazon controls about 30 to 50% of that market. So this is a graph of market share by revenue. Also, to give you guys an understanding, AWS is Amazon's cloud, and AWS by revenue makes up only kind of a fraction of the percentage of how much money Amazon makes from it. But in terms of profit, it is making over 50% of their profit. So it is a big part of Amazon. That's enough about the finances regarding the cloud market. So I want to open up with a quote here from Alex Stamos, who at the time was CISO of Facebook. And so he said that it's still the Wild West. There aren't enough skilled defenders in the world to protect everybody's on-prem IT. So you either join the well-guarded townships and follow the rules, or enjoy the freedom of your own homestead until the bandits come for you. And so he was talking in this case about Office 365 and about how really there's nobody in the world that can run an Exchange server securely except for Microsoft. But when you are using Microsoft's Office 365, you do have to play by their rules. You're not going to always be able to make some of the configuration changes that you might be able to make in your on-prem. You're not always going to have the same decision-making ability. Microsoft is going to end up making those decisions for you. And so that's going to have some limitations for you, but it's also going to hopefully, in general, have an improved security for you. So I focus on AWS and their cloud, and right now there hasn't been a lot of, a lot of news about any big attacks against Amazon specifically, but this is an interesting quote from Marco Slaviero, who works at Thinkst, which is a South African information security company. And he states that the number of known attacks against AWS is small, which is at odds with the huge number and complexity of services available. And so he says that it's not a deep insight to think that eventually there's going to be more attacks as people start, moving more of their businesses onto the cloud, and attackers start looking at the cloud more. So in terms of complexity, it's often valuable to think of AWS like an operating system. And so if you compare the API calls, the number of API calls that exist for Amazon with the number of syscalls that exist for the Windows or Linux operating systems, those OSs only have a few hundred syscalls that you can make, whereas AWS has over 4,000 API calls that you can make. And so those are the lowest level calls that are possible. Additionally, for one of those services, IAM, which is Identity and Access Management, how you define your users and how you define privileges, there's over 1,000 pages for the user guide and over 400 pages for the API reference. And that's only one of the services. And there's 145 services on Amazon today. So it is a very complex thing. So Amazon, and this is true really for all of the cloud vendors, is that they are doing a number of things that you don't. So they do have some improvements around security that you might not have for your own company. And this is because they're a much larger company perhaps. They're able to focus a lot more resources on their cloud environment. And they also are able to see things across a number of customers, a number of deployments, a number of industries. And so, for example, they have their own threat intel team, which is able to see things in a much larger environment than you might be able to. They have their own DDoS response team. They focus a lot on automated reasoning. So whereas a lot of the other vendors out there discuss machine learning, Amazon is really a strong belief that automated reasoning is the next buzzword that people will jump on. So they put out a blog post about how they're doing automated reasoning or formal verification of things like their firmware and their crypto. They also are getting advanced warning of certain vulnerabilities that exist out there because they are such a large vendor that so many people depend on. If any of their customers, for example, might hear about some type of vulnerability, those customers will inform Amazon about it, and Amazon can then look for those in their environment, which then helps protect all of their customers. But they oftentimes don't do some security that you might want. And again, going back to Alex Stamos' quote, you don't always have a choice in this. So sometimes Amazon will release these news announcements and they catch some security people by surprise because you think, like, why weren't you doing that already? That's like kind of a basic security thing that you should have been doing. So an example of this is a few weeks ago, Amazon announced that their Elasticsearch service could now support encrypted communications between Elasticsearch nodes, which for a lot of people is, one of the first things you kind of set up when you set up an Elasticsearch cluster. And this is fairly common throughout all of Amazon, is not only did they not have that encryption, whether it's at rest or in transit, but you also have to enable that manually. It's not given to you by default. So for this announcement, even though now you can have this encrypted traffic, it's not enabled by default. You have to turn that on yourself. And so that's very common across Amazon services. There's a lot of places where that encryption in transit that some people have expectations of that come from higher security environments doesn't exist on Amazon. So an example of that is between two data centers that Amazon might have, you might have the expectation that traffic is going to be via an encrypted tunnel of some sort. But Amazon makes no claims as to whether or not that happens. And so it probably doesn't happen. It's probably sent clear text. So you're responsible for doing that encryption on your own. Another example of a place where you might have expectations of security that Amazon isn't providing is for YubiKeys or U2F support. So up until a few weeks ago, Amazon did not have any U2F support for AWS accounts. And so even though your personal Facebook account, which is unfortunate if it was to get phished or something, that has YubiKey support. But AWS, which runs billion-dollar companies on it, did not have YubiKey support, which means that in order to do your login, you use username and password, and then potentially could also use a hardware security token, so something like a TOTP device, like Google Authenticator, something like that, which gives you a 6-digit code. And those are phishable, whereas the YubiKey is not. And so this is, again, a place where it's kind of surprising to people. Another place is account recovery, or account takeover, is also another name for that. And so if an attacker was able to phish someone's credentials and take over their email account, they could then take over someone's AWS account. And this is problematic because AWS only communicates with people via their root email address associated with their account, which means that in order to avoid single point of failures of making sure that you're receiving communications from Amazon, a lot of people put those root email addresses on distribution lists to a large number of people, which means that if any of those people on that distribution list get their account hacked, they could potentially have that attacker then take over their AWS account and take over their business. Also, another way of doing those takeovers is you can fax a notarized form to Amazon if you don't have access to that email account. Fax machines are hard for everybody to get nowadays, but if an attacker was able to get a fax machine, they could potentially send one of these notarized forms to AWS in order to take over someone's AWS account. So those are some of the concerns because AWS provides oftentimes a very high level of security, but they're also providing the same level of security for everybody. And so you cannot make a request to Amazon to say, you know what, I have a good disaster recovery practices. I don't need any type of account recovery process. Just turn that off for my account. You can't do that with Amazon. That's not a possibility. So what happens though if your account is compromised on AWS? So there is a infamous company called CodeSpaces, and I say infamous as opposed to famous because unfortunately they did not have the opportunity to become famous because they didn't stick around for that long. But they were a GitHub competitor back in 2014, and what an attacker did is he first started DDoSing the company in order to basically distract people and cause high levels of stress. And then he somehow phished someone's credentials and was then able to take over their AWS account while people were looking at this DDoS attack that was happening. Once he took over their AWS account, he locked everybody else out of the account and inserted his own backdoors into the account and then requested a ransom from the company. The company didn't want to pay the ransom, so they went through the account recovery process in order to take over their account again and tried to get the attacker out of their account. And unfortunately, they didn't kick out all of the back doors that the attacker had laid, and the attacker was upset. The ransom wasn't paid, and he then kicked them out again and started deleting all of their data and all of their backups. And so all of their backups were also within that same account. And so unfortunately, the next day, Codespaces just shut down. They no longer had their data. And so that's a valuable lesson, is that always have a good backup plan. Back things up to multiple clouds or multiple places. You can, as a security professional, I hate to say it, but you can be hacked in all sorts of different ways, and it will not impact your company. You could have your credit card stolen, all of your personal information stolen, and it will have an impact, but it won't destroy your company. But if all of your data is destroyed, it will destroy your company. So that becomes very critical. There's also the possibility of having your cloud provider compromised. So this was back in 2015. PagerDuty was compromised, and they realized that the way in which they had been compromised, the only way that that was possible was if their cloud provider was compromised. And so PagerDuty at the time was running on both AWS and Linode. So they had their business split up into both. And they realized that Linode had been compromised. And the assumption is that the attacker had compromised Linode in order to compromise PagerDuty so they could turn off the alerts that another company that they wanted to go after wouldn't receive those alerts. So basically they hack into the other company, the company's not receiving any alerts about being attacked, and so that enables them to do the attacker's job better. So that's something also to be aware of. And PagerDuty is an example of a company that has to have a multi-cloud strategy because they are trying to inform people when someone's site is down. If PagerDuty is down, they can't inform people of that, which means that they have to run on two cloud providers, because if one of the cloud providers goes down, they still have to have another cloud provider that they can run on in order to be able to do their job of informing people of issues. Having a multi-cloud strategy, though, is often not something that you want to do, because this example here is showing the heaviest objects in the universe. One of them is going to be your data, because trying to move your data between different cloud providers is very hard, expensive, slow. So nowadays there's a lot of talk about big data, and big data by definition is going to be big, and big things are going to move slowly. Today, Amazon provides a service where if you want to move your data center into the cloud, they will actually provide a large truck in order to come to your data center, pick up your hard drives, and move them to Amazon's data center. And the reason for that being is that if you have enough data, it is still faster to move a truck full of hard drives than it is to try and send things across the internet. So a lot of people talk about the ability to quickly try and easily and quickly switch between two different clouds, but it becomes a lot more complicated in practice. So here's an example of like the type of truck that they would send. But I want to use this picture to kind of show you another problem with those multi-cloud strategies, is that oftentimes people will choose the lowest common denominator of services because, for example, Amazon offers something called Lambda, which is a serverless service. And that's not offered by all the cloud providers. And so a lot of people won't take advantage of Lambda because they want to make sure that they can easily switch to a different cloud provider. And that means that they cannot use all the efficiencies and benefits of AWS. And so the example here, if you had a large Mack truck and, a sports car and you had a package delivery service, imagine if you only used your big Mack truck to send one package at a time, because that's the number of packages that you could fit in your sports car. You want to be able to take maximum advantage of the environment in which you're running. So there are some additional dangers of the cloud because, so if you don't follow that multi-cloud strategy and you do focus on one cloud, there is the possibility, you have that vendor lock-in, and what happens? That vendor disappears. So imagine if you have a company and everybody's running on Microsoft Windows, and one day Microsoft decides to stop supporting Windows. Your laptops still work. You're not going to get patches anymore. You won't get those software updates, but your laptops would still continue to function. If Amazon or one of the cloud providers decides to stop providing that cloud, you don't have those options. You don't have any type of third party really that can provide the same type of cloud offering that Amazon provides, because it's all proprietary. It's all their own environment. And you also, you're not running any of Amazon's cloud locally. You also have the concern of what happens if one of these cloud providers decides to kick you off of their platform. You know, you've invested the time in, writing code that works in their environment. You have your data there. And what happens if they kick you off? So, an example of this was a few months ago, Google's cloud, unfortunately, decided to kick off a company that was running there because their automated fraud detection systems, for whatever reason, thought that there was something fraudulent happened there. And so it was an automated process. It kicked them off. And that company, not only were they kicked off, but now because they didn't have that account anymore, they couldn't file a support ticket to try and fix the problem. So they had no communications back to Google in order to fix that. Google has now fixed that problem, so it shouldn't happen anymore. But this type of issue is pretty common. So imagine, for example, people that have .ly domains. So for a while, this was pretty popular. Bitly, for example, has a .ly domain. But .ly domains are owned by the Libyan government, and sometimes they have different laws or moral beliefs than other people do in the world. And so there have been a number of cases where people with .ly domains ended up getting their websites removed, and so they no longer had access to them because the Libyan government decided to take action there. So I've talked a lot about the cloud, and so some of you might be more familiar with lower level, hacker type things. So this picture here is basically how a rootkit could work on Windows, or, this is how they used to work a lot of the times. And so the concept here is that when you have a function and you want to call into the operating system, a rootkit, or additionally just security software, that needs to perform additional checks, could insert itself before that API call makes its way into the operating system. And so this is useful because, a security software can do additional checks. It can make sure, it can try and identify if a file being created is going to be malicious. It can do those types of things. In cloud environments, you no longer have those opportunities. You cannot insert yourself into the API calls that are being made in cloud environments. There are no callbacks that exist when someone tries to create an S3 bucket or tries to create an EC2 instance. You basically have to wait until someone has created those things and then go back and try and check what they did there to see whether or not it was malicious or whether or not it was something that complied with the rules in your environment. Another thing that you might have expectations of is that these are, for these cloud environments, they should be using modern tech stacks. You should have API calls for everything. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. So this is, on the top is a logo of Netflix's RepoKit. And in the bottom, there's a screenshot of AWS's Access Advisor, which tells you what privileges someone has actually been using. So RepoKit uses that to determine what the least privileges are that someone should use. And RepoKit wants to be an automated tool in order to be able to check these things, but there's no API calls for Access Advisor. So they created this other tool, Aardvark, which is their logo there, which runs a headless version of Chrome in order to do web scraping against AWS in order to get that information, which is super ugly. I've talked to the developer who's not proud that that was a solution that they had to do, but AWS has never released API calls for this. And this service, Access Advisor, has been around since 2016, so it's been 2 years, and still they don't have a way to call that. You might also have expectation about logs existing for everything that happens in the cloud. And again, this isn't always true. So AWS first started around 2006, and up until 2013, you had no logs of anything that happened in AWS, which is very scary. And even once it was released, it still took another number of years before other services were actually getting their logs written to the service called CloudTrail. And so there are still services today, for example, AppStream, which was released 2 years ago and still doesn't have logs in AWS. This is problematic because some people also will use a concept called Canary Tokens in order to try and detect attackers. And so the concept of Canary Tokens, or honey tokens, is you put something that looks valuable for an attacker. For example, a username and passwords, or on the example of AWS, you put access keys. And if those access keys are ever used, you assume that those must have been compromised, that an attacker has used them, and therefore your environment has been compromised. So people will use that concept on AWS. And unfortunately, because there are calls that are not logged, an attacker can try and use those keys and won't get logged, and so they won't be able to be detected. And AWS ends up providing error messages that are more useful than a lot of security people would prefer. And so in the case of this app stream call, it will inform you what your account ID is and what the username is of the user that tried to make that call. So if the username is something like Canary, then it's, or Honey Token, then it's going to be a Honey Token, and attackers will then realize that they should not use that key anymore. So outside of AWS, you also, you do have attackers that are attacking these different cloud environments. So Office 365, for example, there's an APT group, APT35, I guess, that FireEye, through their Mandiant business unit, describes. And what they're doing is they are changing configuration settings in Office 365, which is the email service provided by Microsoft, and they are able to basically redirect or be able to get access to all the different emails at a company. And so it's interesting to think about this because there's no malware involved in this. There's nothing that an antivirus could detect. There's nothing to upload to VirusTotal. There are no Yara signatures that you can create for something like this. There's nothing even that, your network security monitoring could do, because you can access Office 365 from anywhere in the world. You cannot, do forensics onto a server. You cannot pull, a server and start, looking in logs, looking at the hard drive for, deleted space or anything like that. A lot of your concepts of security are changing in the cloud. And so it's important to be able to realize that this is happening. Another example here, this was from May 2017, there was an Oauth Worm that hit Gmail. And so what this would do is it would send an email to people and say, look at this document. And if they were to click on that link, it would, pop up this message saying, Google Docs would like to have access to various things. And people say, oh, it's Google Docs, and I'm trying to look at a document. This is okay. And in this situation, what would happen is it wasn't the real Google Docs, and it would be able to get access to people's email and also be able to send emails. And so through this, it was a worm that was able to get sent out to everybody that was running Gmail. And so a lot of companies got hit with this. And again, it's important to realize that this is running within the API calls that exist within these different cloud environments. So there's no malware involved. In this case, there wasn't even any phishing of credentials or anything involved. And so, even if someone is running a Chromebook or something that, you think, oh, it can't be hacked, it can't get any malware on it. There's no, hopefully Google is doing a good enough job, so there's no, exploits that'll work against it. This is using the default functionality of these providers to do the things that the providers were meant to do. So again, these are the types of attacks to worry about. This picture here is a chicken farm where you can see all the chickens look alike. And I'm using this to show just how homogeneous the cloud environments are. So, if you look at two different companies, they might be on different versions of Windows, different patch levels, things like that. They haven't caught up. In AWS, everybody's on the same version of AWS. Give or take about a week, because AWS does rolling deployments to their customers of new things. Everybody's on the same version, which is good and bad. It means that for an attacker, they can write the same code in order to spin up Bitcoin miners on everybody's AWS environments if they're able to find some type of flaw or issue or take advantage of something. But it also enables, consultants like me or software to be able to easily scan people's environments because they all look the same. I know that if I'm able to write something that works in my AWS environment, it's going to be able to work in everybody else's AWS environment. So that makes things a lot easier. You don't have to do as much of that quality assurance as you did when you were running things in different operating systems. Let's see. Other benefits of the cloud is, you're able to spin up a lot of servers easily when you need them. So there was the Shattered paper where Google was able to find a SHA-1 hash collision between two files. And they were able to do this because they were able to take advantage of all this processing power that is provided in the cloud, and that's provided in such a way that you can take advantage of it during off-peak hours. So basically, computation is going to be cheaper at certain points of the day. And so by taking advantage of the times of the day in which it's cheap, you can buy that processing power in order to do attacks like this. Those two other logos are from security tools, open source security tools that were released by Airbnb. So on the left is going to be Binary Alert, and on the right is Stream Alert. And what binary alert does is when an incoming file comes in, it gets emailed or something like that, it spins up all these serverless processes in order to do Yara scanning against it. And so it can very quickly and very efficiently be able to scan files with Yara in order to detect malware. Likewise, Stream Alert does something similar for logs. So if you imagine suddenly there's this huge spike of logs coming in, normally your processes are going to have to try and chug through that, or you're going to have additional extra capacity sitting around waiting for one of those spikes to happen. Whereas with Stream Alert, it's all serverless, so it's able to spin up servers as needed in order to do that processing. There's other benefits of running in the cloud. I mentioned there are some problems with not everything being logged, not all the APIs being logged, but a number of them are. And so Cloud Tracker is a tool I worked on with Duo Security. And what this does is it looks at your different API calls that are used by someone, and it looks at the privileges that are granted, and then it does a diff of those in order to identify what adjustments should happen. And so by doing this, it's able to ensure that you have a least privilege strategy in your environment. So this and the other tools that I've talked about are all open source tools that are available. Additionally, what it does is it makes use of an AWS service called Athena. And Athena works by being able to run MapReduce against data that's stored in S3 buckets. So again, instead of, for myself as a consultant, I can come in, I can find, their logs. And even if they haven't loaded their logs into something like Splunk or some other SIM that makes them easily queryable, as long as I just have a dump of logs, I can point this tool at those and be able to basically instantly be able to get results back, because I don't have to download those logs and start doing ingestion to something like Elasticsearch. It's able to run these MapReduce queries on many machines all at once against that one log source. In the bottom right here is another picture of a tool that I worked on with Duo called Cloud Mapper, again open source. And what this does is it looks in your AWS environments for the resources that you have, so your EC2s, your databases, your load balancers, and it's able to create network graphs of those, and it's able to draw the lines between them based on the firewall rules that it finds. And so you look at the firewall rules in order to understand what can talk to what, and then you're able to draw one of these graphs showing what the communication paths are that exist in your environment. And this is oftentimes better than what you might see otherwise, where some tools will only show you the communication paths that do exist, so where network traffic is flowing, whereas this is showing you what can talk to what, which from an attacker perspective, or from a defensive perspective where you're trying to find what an attacker could do, this becomes valuable for them. And there's still a lot of tools that still need to be built out there to take advantage of all the data and all the APIs that these different cloud providers are providing. There is probably an easy way to create businesses around just trying to create tools like this. So here's some example of some other places where there's a lot of APIs and logs and not a lot of tools that take advantage of them. So you can find all of the resources that are publicly exposed in an environment very easily. So you don't have to, Nmap scan against someone's IP range. You can just, be able to get a list of all the different servers that are exposed and the port numbers of all those servers. You can do that in very easy ways. So these are just some other examples of types of things that you can do. Another thing, that last bullet is pretty important, because in a lot of cases, when you bring someone in to assess your environments, you give them full privileges, or you have them watch over someone's shoulder that has those full privileges. Whereas in these different cloud environments, you oftentimes can give someone only read-only access. So that pen tester, cannot make any changes in your environment. They can't exfil any data from your environment. They can only see the metadata that exists in your environment. And so that becomes very valuable, because you can do these security assessments more often than you might have otherwise, and do them with more consultants or more third parties, because you don't have to worry about the same problems that you would have otherwise. So here's an example of a tool from Netflix called Security Monkey that does take advantage of these different APIs that are possible. So Security Monkey was released in 2014, and a lot of people know it as a tool for being able to assess the security of an AWS environment. But it can also assess the security of Google Cloud's environment, and then also GitHub repositories. So companies that have their own private GitHub repos, it can check whether or not those are actually private, and whether or not the users of those repos have two-factor authentication turned on and some other checks there. So SecurityMonkey is leveraging those APIs. And there's still a lot of different cloud providers and SaaS solutions out there that there aren't these types of tools for. There's also the concept in all these different cloud providers of pets or cattle versus pets. That the cattle's you had historically these pets which were long-lived servers, and you got to know them. You knew their quirks in different ways. Whereas today with cattle, if there's any type of problems, you just kill that server and spin up a new one. And this again creates different ways of thinking about things in security, because you can't do forensics on these servers if they're instantly killed and new ones spun up. You have difficulties being able to acquire things like memory images on the different cloud environments. And it's also been interesting because it's enabled, this different way of doing things has enabled a lot of new companies to come up, not so much from a technology perspective, but also just from a licensing perspective of things. So historically, you bought licenses based on the number of servers that you had. But in a cloud environment, during peak hours, you might spin up 1,000 servers, and then off peak hours, you shut them all down. Next day, you spin up another 1,000 servers, and then you shut them down again. And for historical licensing models, they would charge you 2,000 licenses because you had 2,000 servers in total, even though at one time you were only using 1,000 licenses. And so because of that, that has created a lot of opportunities for companies out there to start creating new products with different licensing models that take advantage of the cloud in different ways. So I've talked a lot about the cloud, and some of you guys are, maybe thinking to yourself, like, I would never, my company would never do that. My industry would never get on there. But it's valuable to understand that AWS actually has a concept of partitions, and they are actually running basically 4 cloud environments at the same time. The one that everybody thinks about is AWS Standard. And so this is the one that, you would create yourself if you were, you would get an AWS Standard account if you were to go to AWS's website. But if you happen to be in China, you would use AWS China, which is a very separate, it's actually owned by a separate company entirely. It's not owned by Amazon or AWS. It's owned by a local Chinese company due to regulations there. But it is kind of within AWS's umbrella. There's also GovCloud, which is what the United States government is running on there. And there's also then a region called AWS Secret Region, which the United States government's intelligence agencies are actually running on AWS. And so they are running not only secret classified information there, but also top secret information. So the deepest, darkest secrets of America's intelligence agencies are going to be on AWS. So again, you might not use Amazon's cloud, but there might be a local cloud or, something else that, your countries might use. And so it's important to realize that this is happening, it is coming, and you are going to be forced to deal with it. Again, not only from different security perspectives, but there's also financial incentives of being able to easily spin up these different different servers and spin them up rapidly, and not have to worry about getting arrangements with different data centers, or talking to a server vendor in order to make purchase agreements and figure out how much electricity and cooling you need, and all those additional difficulties. It can often be cheaper and faster to be able to use these cloud services. So that's all I had for you guys. Thank you. Questions? Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. Any question? Yeah.
Thank you for a very energizing talk. I appreciated that very much. I attended AWS workshop lately with engineers, and they told us that a business strategy of Amazon is very often to push out a minimum viable product, and then wait for feedback and then upgrade where it needed. Would you agree to the statement that they are also pushing out minimal viable security and then wait for the feedback?
Not on purpose, but they are putting out, they are taking advantage of the agile approach and trying to put out something there and get customer feedback. So whenever, for example, AWS reInvent is going to happen in a couple of weeks in Las Vegas, and Amazon is going to announce some new services. When they announce those new services are not going to log anything to CloudTrail, which means that if an attacker can take advantage of those to, mine Bitcoin or anything like that, you're not going to know about that until, well, I guess you'd know about it once you get your bill and realize it's, a couple tens of thousands of dollars more than it normally is. But those are the types of problems. It's not going to provide VPC support, meaning you can't do all of the firewall configurations that you might be able to expect to do. Another example is, again, with Elasticsearch that I mentioned, which has been a very problematic service, I think, for AWS. When it first came out, the way in which people believe Elasticsearch runs is all customers are running on a very large Elasticsearch cluster. And so, or at least that's how it was when it first came out. And so because of that, AWS did not provide you any of the error logs from Elasticsearch, which means that if you were trying to send data, for example, send your logs into Elasticsearch, you could not find out whether or not those logs successfully were written to Elasticsearch. And so this was a deal breaker for a lot of people. And so yes, so there is definitely the concept of minimum viable product that they slowly improve, and hopefully they eventually improve it to a level that is beyond the capacities that you might have for yourself. But when they are first released, it definitely has some gotchas to it. Yeah.
Any other question?
How often do applications break due to API updates distributed by Amazon?
I obviously don't know or have any stats on that, but I think that AWS is good in ensuring backwards compatibility of things. And what they actually do is when you're using AWS's API calls, you oftentimes end up using a library called Bodo. And behind the scenes, Bodo is actually versioning all of those API calls based on the date in which Bodo thinks the newest version is. And so what happens is you will end up making API calls to an endpoint from, maybe 2014 or, some number of years ago. And so because of that, your API calls should never break. But there is the possibility, which is an interesting research area, is that AWS does not have the ability to disable any of those old endpoints. And so there's all these old versions of things, which from a security perspective is usually an interesting area, that AWS does not have the ability to shut down. And so there are potentially, vulnerabilities or interesting bug cases that might exist if you were to leverage some of those old APIs. Yeah.
So we have time for another question. Someone? So thank you again, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you.